My journey with AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, began on July 4th, 1981. Very good friend of mine who lived across the hall from me in a small apartment building in Greenwich Village cut out a piece of an article that was in the New York Times and stuck it underneath my door. And on a Post-it, he wrote, "This is what Paul died from." I read the article, and 3 weeks later, my friend who was living across the hall was one of the first 6 people diagnosed in New York City that I knew of.
Rare cancer is seen in 41 homosexuals. That was the title of the article that David Pais's neighbor shared with him. The article wasn't even a front-page story. It was a short piece buried deep on page 20. But it became kind of infamous in the gay community because it was the first news of what would eventually become a medical crisis, one that intensified as it grew worse over the following years, with no end in sight. Here's how ABC News put it at the time.
It's mysterious, it's deadly, and it's baffling medical science. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome.
David is in his 70s, and like many gay men of his age, he has vivid memories of the early days of the AIDS epidemic. He remembers especially the agonizing end of his neighbor's life.
From July to November of 1981, I saw this young, vibrant, 30-year-old man morph into the closest example of sainthood I had ever seen. He told his doctors that anybody newly diagnosed could call him at any hour of the day to just talk, and he would try to relieve their fears or anxieties.
David's friend died on November 1st that year. To David, who had been born and raised Catholic, the date was significant. It was All Saints' Day. He vowed to do something about the epidemic, so he volunteered with a new group called Gay Men's Health Crisis. He recalled that it was his Catholic faith that compelled him to act.
I felt like it was similar to Christ dealing with lepers and inviting them and including them and reaching out to them. And it was a very powerful thing for me.
From America Media, I'm Michael O'Loughlin. This is Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS in the Catholic Church. I'm a journalist covering the Catholic Church in the United States. It's a big beat, and I've written about everything from Catholics attending climate change rallies, to parishes responding to mass shootings, to the Pope's use of Twitter. But in recent years, perhaps no other story has been as personal to me as to how the institutional church interacts with the LGBT community.
Another employee fired at a Catholic school for being in a same-sex marriage.
A teachers union will not go to bat for a gay teacher fired from a Catholic high school.
A senior Vatican official came out today announcing publicly that he is gay.
It was the Pope's comments on gays that has the world talking tonight.
The Pope says the Catholic Church owes an apology to gay individuals and others who have been mistreated.
Like David, I'm also gay and Catholic. People often ask me how I reconcile these two parts of my identity. The truth is, for a long time, I didn't have a good answer. That's why I started seeking out people like David, who could tell me about their own experiences. Their stories are mine to inherit, and I want to share them. What I heard repeatedly is that the stories about Catholics during the height of the AIDS crisis need to be more well known. That there are lessons for us today. There are names we should remember, and unless we make an effort to learn these stories, they might be lost to history. The more I listened, the more complicated the story became. That's what I'm trying to do with this podcast. Take a look at this time and explore how the church responded when the LGBT community fell under siege. More after the break.
Support for this podcast comes from the Catholic Health Association. CHA represents the nation's largest group of non-profit healthcare providers. With more than 600 hospitals and 1,600 long-term care and other health facilities in all 50 states, the Catholic Health Ministry cares for 1 in 7 patients in the U.S. Learn more at chausa.org.
Let's get back to David. Like the dozens of other people I've interviewed for this podcast, he said conveying how truly frightening this time period was for the gay community is difficult to comprehend today, especially for people like me who were too young to remember.
At that point in the epidemic, if you were diagnosed, it was a death sentence. It was overwhelmingly scary.
Between 1981 and 1996, more than 300,000 Americans died from AIDS-related complications. That's equivalent to the entire population of Pittsburgh, cut down by a deadly disease. Entire apartment buildings were decimated. I'm not the first to make this observation, but the only image that seems to capture what was happening in the 80s and 90s is that of plague.
In 5 short years, according to the Public Health Service, AIDS could become one of the top 10 causes of death in the United States. Right now, perhaps 1.5 million Americans are carrying the AIDS virus. AIDS is striking home in America, striking home in ways scarcely imaginable a few years ago.
Young gay men were dying in large clusters from this mysterious disease. It wasn't just death that caused fear. The disease caused massive suffering. As one person put it to me, it turned people into frail walking skeletons. In the early 80s, the time David's describing, no one knew if it would be possible to treat AIDS, how many people were even contracting it, or who might die next. 30 years later, we know you cannot be infected with HIV through a handshake or a hug or by drinking out of the same cup. It's only transmitted by certain body fluids. Now, there's medication to prevent transmission as well as to manage the illness. Today in New York, for example, transmissions are at an all-time low. But in the 80s, all people knew was that their friends were disappearing. It's still not easy for survivors to talk about the horror they experienced. I met David in his office at the Gay Men's Health Crisis. It's one of the largest HIV and AIDS nonprofits in New York. The building is so big, it's easy to get lost. Across its 10 floors, it offers HIV testing, counseling, meals, a pharmacy, art classes, housing help, and more.
And we'll feed upwards of 400 people every day in here.
David spoke to me just before he was set to leave for a 6-week-long pilgrimage in Spain.
When I realized it was 500 miles, I figured, you better start going to the gym, David. This confirmed couch potato has become a gym bunny.
Gay Men's Health Crisis is something of a public health juggernaut today. But David was involved long before the group even had a room to meet in.
I want that to be known that the first public education program that was ever held in Greenwich Village was held in a Catholic church. That's the beginning of the church's role as I know it.
It wasn't a church-sponsored event. Rather, David was a parishioner and the AIDS group needed a space to meet. So David first asked permission from the priests at St. Joe's in Greenwich Village to use the parish school. But so many people showed up, they couldn't fit. So the priests offered the church itself. Since the point of that meeting was to provide safe sex education in order to prevent the spread of HIV, this meant candid and often graphic questions and answers about sex.
It was raucous. People were not used to hearing the very honest and very direct statements coming from these community educators. As much as we knew about the epidemic at that point was offered.
One of the reasons David volunteered to educate people about AIDS was because he saw the effects of the mysterious disease up close. Can you tell me a little bit about your partner, Bill?
He was a young man. He was originally from Long Island. When we met, he was living in Philadelphia. He was an accountant. And when he moved in, we were in love.
The same year David and Bill moved in together, gay men's health crisis was encouraging men to be tested for HIV. This recommendation was fairly controversial. Some men preferred simply not to know, as the suffering they saw among their friends and partners was just too much to bear. And any effective medication was still a decade off. But David felt he had a responsibility to be tested, especially since he was telling others to do the same. So he and Bill had blood drawn.
When we both were diagnosed, he had something like 125 T cells. So he actually had AIDS at that point. And I tested positive. And I don't know why it was, but I knew that I had to put all my energy and focus into taking care of him and keeping him as healthy as possible. And then I figured later on I'll worry about what's going on with me. So that's basically what I did.
HIV is particularly dangerous because it attacks your body's ability to heal itself. Normally, T cells are what your body uses to fight infection. People diagnosed with HIV have to monitor their T cell count, because a reading below 200 T cells means that HIV has led to AIDS. And once that happens, a person's immune system becomes so compromised that the body is unable to fight off common infections. So things like pneumonia can easily become lethal. Bill now had AIDS, and David knew he had HIV, the virus that can lead to AIDS. There's no simple explanation for why, but in just a couple of years, Bill's health deteriorated dramatically, but David's remained stable.
For the next 2 years, I became the partner I had always hoped I would be. And Bill died in June of 1987. I'm still processing that death. I remember, even as he was dying, that I was so grateful for God bringing him into my life. And God was never more tangible than my love and attention and service to Bill.
When Bill died, David turned to his faith, finding a home with Dignity New York. This was a group for gay men and women that held Mass each week inside a Catholic church called St. Francis Xavier. It offered a fellowship for a community still very much on the fringes. Like David, a lot of other group members had also lost partners and friends to AIDS. But in October 1986, church leaders in Rome issued a letter that led to the expulsion of groups like Dignity from churches all over the world, including David's group in New York.
When we were asked to leave this parish, I felt like I was being thrown out of my home, and I had just lost my lover. So it was like a double whammy.
In addition to kicking out groups like Dignity, the Vatican letter also repeated church teaching that said homosexuality was, quote, ordered toward an intrinsic moral evil, and that it is a, quote, objective disorder. The history of the letter is a little complicated, but it's important to understand in order to see why gay Catholics say they were so hurt by it. Here it goes. The church had taught that homosexual acts were sinful, but simply being gay was not. But the Vatican in the 1980s was concerned that some Catholics were using that nuanced teaching to suggest that being gay might actually be a good thing. This didn't sit well with some church leaders in Rome, who felt they had to clarify the church's prohibition on homosexual acts again, this time in the 1986 letter. This letter now stressed that although homosexual orientation was not sinful in itself, an inclination toward homosexual acts could not be considered neutral or good. I told you it was complicated. Anyway, the timing of this letter, at the height of the AIDS crisis, felt especially cruel to many of the gay Catholics I interviewed. You can see why. Gay men are getting sick, dying. To some, the letter felt like being kicked while they were already down. Plus, the letter seemed to blame gay men for the onslaught of AIDS.
It was always kind of a fear, from childhood, of people discovering who you are and rejecting you. And that's what it felt like.
David felt his faith was baked into his identity. It motivated him to reach out to people with AIDS and to do what he could to ease their anxiety and fear. He said he compartmentalized his faith, embracing his local faith community while ignoring hurtful comments from some church leaders. But the Vatican's hard line on homosexuality had now affected him directly. He had lost his community. He said he had had enough and that he had to speak up. A lot of other gay Catholics felt the same. So Dignity organized a series of protests. They called it the Cathedral Project.
Generally, what we would do is we would go to the cathedral. We would respectfully go in and sit in the pews, and we would participate in Mass until the priest got up to deliver his homily, and then we would all stand up and turn our backs to the priest. I believe there were police in the back of the church. Usually the ushers would come up and wave us to the aisle and then walk us out. And the police were back there just to reinforce that we shouldn't cause a disturbance.
David didn't want other Catholics to feel uncomfortable at Mass. He and his friends just wanted to be able to worship at their parish. They wanted an apology for the pain they felt.
I was acting as a witness to the refusal of the church to love all of its members equally. And we really didn't want to disrupt the Mass. At least I didn't want to disrupt the Mass. Because for me, I respected why people were there. I just really wanted to say, we have a right to be here too. We have a right to be welcomed into this house of God.
The protests went on for a few months, but they didn't seem to work. Dignity wasn't allowed back on church property. Eventually, several protesters were even arrested, including a priest and a person with AIDS. The effects of all this, losing dozens of friends to AIDS, the death of his partner, being shut out from his church, it was all too much for David. He decided he had to leave.
I distinctly stepped away. Bolted might be a better term. I can't spend all of my time and energy angry and fighting the church when I have to use it for survival.
For David and other protesters, fighting the church meant calling attention to the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal John O'Connor. He was a former Navy admiral whom Pope John Paul II chose to lead the church in New York in 1984.
I was not a fan. Let me just put it that way.
O'Connor has been called the most powerful archbishop of his generation. He had the ears of political leaders. President Ronald Reagan even appointed him to the White House's AIDS Commission. O'Connor could influence debate about a wide range of issues. He spent a lot of time advocating for the poor and the homeless in New York. He spoke out against racism and anti-Semitism. He was a strong proponent of labor rights. But David said the gay community often felt like the cardinal was targeting them. For example, O'Connor fought bills that would protect gay people from housing and job discrimination. And O'Connor was clear about the church's teaching on homosexuality.
Homosexual behavior, not an inclination. Homosexual behavior is illicit. That's the teaching of the Catholic Church. I am a Catholic bishop.
That's him on Charlie Rose. And here he is preaching on the topic, saying the church could not approve of civil rights for gay people.
The legal approval of homosexual conduct and activity, something that the Catholic Church and indeed other religious faiths consider to
It's a little difficult to hear because he's inside a church, but O'Connor says, quote, the legal approval of homosexual conduct is, quote, morally wrong. We're going to come back to David in a minute. At this point, it's 1989. He's still volunteering with Gay Men's Health Crisis and tending to friends with AIDS. But he doesn't want anything to do with the church. Even protesting was getting too close to it for him. But other people continue to protest the cardinal, like members of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP. In December 1989, ACT UP stormed New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's fair to say their tactics were more radical than Dignity's.
This is Jesus Christ. I'm in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Sunday. Inside, Cardinal O'Connor is busy spreading his lies and rumors about the position of lesbians and gays. We're here to say we want to go to heaven too.
There was overlap between the two groups, but there's a distinction. Dignity was trying to change the church from the inside. ACT UP was taking issue with the church's actions in the public square. ACT UP aimed its anger at many institutions, the federal government, Wall Street, pharmaceutical companies. Many of the activists believed the church was making the AIDS crisis worse by opposing safe-sex education in public schools, condemning homosexuality, and fighting against rights for gays and lesbians. Michael Petrellis was one of those protesters. He lives in San Francisco now, and I spoke to him on the phone.
There was a lot of anger from all of us activists inside that church, and that epidemic, that plague, was greatly helped by the church and the church's interference in public health policies that kept condoms from people who needed condoms. They hindered distribution of condoms and needles that would have stemmed the flow of the spread of AIDS.
ACT UP members were angry about a lot of things. They were angry that their friends were dying. They were terrified they might be next. They were angry about the homophobia and the abuse gay people saw in every sector of society. And as Michael says, ACT UP members were angry at Cardinal O'Connor because of his opposition to safe-sex education and policies that would protect gay people from discrimination. That's why they decided to target St. Patrick's. As part of the protest, they made pamphlets that were designed to look like worship aids, which help worshipers follow along during Mass.
Opportunity for us to get out our printed information in the form of a false St. Patrick's Cathedral program. We do not challenge anybody's right to worship, so that's right up front. But then it goes on basically with our
The morning of the protest, thousands of people gathered near the cathedral. Some held placards with messages like, quote, condoms, not prayers, and, quote, Cardinal O'Connor won't teach safe sex. The NYPD stopped the obvious protesters from entering the cathedral, but Petrellis was dressed in his Sunday best. He skirted around officers and fellow ACT UP members and slipped into the cathedral from a side entrance. He chose a pew and waited for the Mass to begin.
My recollection is that Archbishop O'Connor began the service by mentioning that, there were many protesters in their service, and that he was asking the congregation to pray with him for a peaceful service. Well, a peaceful service did not happen.
A few minutes into the Cardinal's sermon, members of ACT UP threw their bodies onto the cold, hard marble floor. But O'Connor continued preaching. Petrellis' anger was boiling over. He was afraid the action was failing, that it wasn't generating the right kind of attention. So he reached into his pocket, took out a whistle, put it between his lips, stood up on his pew, and blew as hard as he could. Later, during an unplanned part of the protest, as the congregation approached the altar for communion, another activist crumbled up the Eucharist, the body of Christ, and threw it to the ground. This act of sacrilege became the story in the next morning's papers. The public seemed to have sided with the church. Even the protester who did it said years later that he probably wouldn't have thrown the host on the floor today because he didn't realize at the time how offensive it would be to Catholics. I asked David, who at this point had walked away from the church, what he made of it all.
I can't defend what they did in disrupting the Mass and in treating the host in the way that they did treat it. But I could understand their anger and their frustration. So I also thought that politically it was counterproductive.
Even within ACT UP, members were really conflicted about what had happened.
It brought up stuff for me I didn't even know was like lingering in the nooks and crannies of my brain and my soul.
This is Jerry Wells. On the one hand, she felt like the church was her enemy. On the other hand, it still felt like her church. This is her talking to an ACT UP oral history project in 2007.
That wasn't my church on some level, you know. Even though I'm a Catholic and it is my church. So I had a lot of mixed feelings about it. My mother was teaching.
Jerry's decision to protest hurt her family too, especially her mother, who was Catholic.
My mother saw it on Eyewitness News. You know, me being really radical with my black beret on, you know, singing, screaming silence equals death in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And she didn't talk to me for about 2 weeks. It was very painful, you know. She said, I can't talk. Every channel I turned on, you were screaming in church, you know, and I don't know how to deal with this. You know, she was honest, you know. And then 2 weeks later, she bought me a little Waterford crystal cathedral of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And she says, you know, I understand why you did it.
Following the protests, the debate was framed as gay people versus the church. But this framing is not entirely correct. There were many gay Catholics protesting at the cathedral, people who felt under siege by the AIDS crisis and abandoned by their church. And even though it appeared O'Connor clashed constantly with New York's gay community, in private, his actions reveal an even more complicated story. This is him on Charlie Rose again.
I decided that I should come to understand firsthand what this really is. So I set myself a goal of visiting, washing the bed sores, of emptying the bedpans, of talking with a minimum of 1,000 persons with AIDS, their families or others. I got to 1,100. I learned a great deal. I tried my very best to help. Many of those were homosexual.
It turns out David and the Cardinal were both visiting AIDS patients at New York Catholic hospitals around the same time. A Catholic sister who worked with countless numbers of people with AIDS remembers O'Connor's visits.
Cardinal O'Connor did what he said he was going to do. He came and visited patients at St. Clair's. Some people thought it was wonderful. Some people criticized him for doing that.
That's Sister Pascal Conforti. She worked on the pastoral care team at St. Clair's Hospital in New York's Hell's Kitchen neighborhood. It was one of the first hospitals in the city to offer dedicated care for people with AIDS. David remembers Sister Pascal from his own activist days. He has glowing things to say about her. Sister Pascal told me during a visit to her retirement community just outside New York that the Cardinal visited patients away from the limelight.
I knew when he was coming in because the next morning, one of the patients would say, oh, gee, this really swell priest was in. That was Cardinal O'Connor. Say, because there you're not dealing with the hierarchy. What's the position? You know.
Sister Pascal is a well-known figure when it comes to AIDS care in New York. She visited countless patients, and she advocated for their best interests. One doctor told me a story about Sister Pascal. She had been the only person on staff who could get a patient who had been saving up for a sex change operation to open up about why he was resisting a placement of a life-saving chest catheter. The patient, who used male pronouns at the time, told Sister Pascal that he was afraid that the needle would harm the breast implants that he'd scrimped and saved for. Unlike the many doctors and nurses who couldn't get the patient to open up, Sister Pascal listened. She told the patient she understood. She then worked with the medical team to ensure the patient that his wishes would be respected. Sister Pascal was sensitive to the needs of her patients. She was comfortable around the LGBT community and became sort of an ally. But she still resists the image of O'Connor as a kind of villain that some in ACT UP tried to paint during this time. What did patients tell you about their visits with him?
They loved them. These are very sick people, Mike. I didn't say, well, what did you talk about? They just liked him. He was a priest, and he came to minister to them, and probably he blessed them. But none of them said, what's he doing here? Because it wasn't that kind of controversy.
Despite the fiery conflict playing out between the gay community and the church, there wasn't always a neat divide. That is, there were lots of gay Catholics still very much inside the church, or at least trying to find a place for themselves. That's something David grappled with. He was still angry at the Catholic Church, but the AIDS epidemic was raging, and he felt he needed spiritual support. He went to a friend, a priest in the Episcopal Church, another Christian denomination, for advice.
And I remember very specifically, he looked at me and he said, David, I can't recommend an Episcopal parish to you. You're hopelessly Catholic.
David's friend told him to go back to St. Francis Xavier, the same church that Dignity had been kicked out of back when David walked away from the church. Going back to that space to worship was an emotional challenge for him. So he hid at the back of the church, sitting near the doors, in case he felt he needed to leave.
So 2 weeks later, on a very hot Sunday in August, I walk in for Mass, and I sit in the back of the last pew in the church, ready to bolt at the first homophobic thing I heard coming from the pulpit. And at the end of the Mass, I was in tears. Because I felt I had found a place where I could be who I was. I could offer all the gifts that I had been given, and I could be an active participant in that faith community.
When I visited David's church, I was struck by its grand scale. Elaborate paintings of the Stations of the Cross, its colorful antique Tiffany window. But one of David's favorite details about his parish is at the front of the church. When the church was restored almost a decade ago, the kneelers were taken off the pews and fashioned into the altar. The kneelers on which David prayed when Bill was dying, when he grappled with his own HIV diagnosis, when he lost dozens of friends, those kneelers are now the centerpiece of the church.
And so now all those years of people's prayers is congregated in the altar.
The story of AIDS in the United States cannot be separated from the Catholic Church. As David told us, the first meeting of gay men's health crisis actually took place inside a Catholic church. Many ACT UP members were raised Catholic, and there were lots of priests and nuns who put their own vocations on the line to minister to gay men and their partners. Catholic hospitals around the country were among the first to offer treatment to people with AIDS. This is all to say, there's a lot to learn from this time period. Nearly 3 decades later, we risk losing these stories if we don't capture them now. That's what I'm aiming to do with this podcast. I want to share the stories from the height of the AIDS crisis, both those that inspire and those that infuriate, so we can remember what happens when society turns its back on those in need. During the height of the AIDS crisis, tens of thousands of people, at first mostly gay men, became unbearably sick, unable to care for themselves. Many institutions and individuals turned their backs, but some people didn't. Even when they didn't know how HIV spread or how dangerous AIDS really was, part of the church responded to that gospel call to care for those who were sick. That's why it's been so moving to me to learn from David, whose own stories seem representative of so many others during this time.
I just want to say that there are some really incredible stories about active Catholics who were real heroes in the AIDS epidemic. Many of them were probably non-practicing Catholics by that stage of the game, but they had learned very intensely and closely the importance of social justice and gospel values, and were very engaged in living those. And those served as inspirations to me. And many of the people who were doing that work are gone now. So they are part of my litany of the saints that continue to inspire me to do this work.
As for David's own journey, he's thriving today, still working to help people with HIV and AIDS. His relationship to the Catholic Church has taken some time to heal, with lots of patience on his part. But he finally feels like he's back home.
It took me some time to realize that I'm as Catholic as the Pope, and that my baptismal consecration made me as legitimate a Catholic as anybody else. And nobody's kicking me out of my house. I'm going to stay, I'm going to fight, I'm going to make it a safer place for all of God's people.
Nowadays, David commutes to St. Francis Xavier from Brooklyn, and he sits in the front row. On the next episode, how a Catholic hospital in New York confronts its own bias to become a haven for the gay community during the AIDS epidemic.
We were a Catholic hospital under the auspices of perhaps the most conservative archbishop in the country. There was some, as there always is, very activist, some would say radical, people for whom we were never doing enough.
Plague, Untold Stories of AIDS and the Catholic Church is a production of America Media. I'm your host, Michael O'Loughlin. This series was written and produced by me and Eloise Blondio. The executive producer is Sebastian Gomes. Thanks to the team at America Media who helped make this episode happen. Kerry Weber, Father Sam Sawyer, Tucker Redding, and Isabel Seneschal. Sound design by Rebecca Seidel. Original music by Christopher McCormick. Art by Sean Tripoli and Allison Hamilton. Parts of this episode were recorded in the William J. Loschert studio at America Media in New York. This podcast was made possible through the generosity of Mark A. McDermott and Yuval David, whose gift honors and supports all LGBTQ+ persons and allies, past and present. Special thanks to Anna Marchese, Robert David Sullivan, and Jeffrey Stone. Archival audio was provided by the ACT UP Oral History Project, Jim Hubbard, and the Archdiocese of New York. For more about this episode, visit americamag.org/plague, and let me know what you think by following me on Twitter at Mike O'Loughlin. That's MikeOlouglin. Thanks for listening.
Support for this podcast comes from the Catholic Health Association. CHA represents the nation's largest group of non-profit healthcare providers. With more than 600 hospitals and 1,600 long-term care and other health facilities in all 50 states, the Catholic Health Ministry cares for 1 in 7 patients in the U.S. Learn more at chausa.org.